So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the AI House at Davos and to this panel on the impact of AI in armed conflict. A little bit different, probably, to some of the other panels you might have seen today. I'm Neil Davison. I'm from the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue, which is a private diplomacy and mediation organisation in Geneva, working to help prevent and resolve conflict. And yeah, it's really exciting to be moderating this panel today. Obviously, machine learning is infiltrating every aspect of our lives, and armed conflict is no different. From the use of AI by militaries to identify objects, people, vehicles that they might target, and on the flip side, the use of those same systems like computer vision by humanitarian actors to identify, for example, unexploded landmines for clearance. So we're going to try and get at this kind of dual aspects of the use of AI today. AI in itself is a quintessentially dual-use technology, has both civilian and military applications, even though obviously the advances are coming from the civilian sector. And obviously in conflict it can be used across the board, from recruiting soldiers through to targeting them. So there's a lot to discuss today, and we have the sort of advantage to have experts from both sides of this debate, and we really want to bring in you, the audience, to the discussion later. So first, let me introduce our panel today. On my right is Isabel Ebert. She's an advisor in the US Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Her focus is on responsible business conduct in the technology sector. She's a member of the OECD AI group of experts. Next is Gilles Carbonnier. He's Vice President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC. You may have seen in the news yesterday, facilitating hostage release. And Gilles has 30 years of experience in humanitarian operations, and at the helm of an organization with over 160 years responding to the impact of conflicts on the ground. Next, we have Jean-Marc Rickli. He's head of Global and Emerging Risks and director of the Polymath Initiative at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He's also co-curating the International Security Map, part of a strategic intelligence platform of the World Economic Forum. And finally, Rebecca Moreno-Jimenez is a lead data scientist and innovation officer at the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. And she focuses on big data science, artificial intelligence to improve protection and decision-making in the humanitarian sector. So I think perhaps we'll start with military applications and some of the risks and developments that are raised there. And I'd like to start with Jean-Marc. I know you've been focusing on these issues for some years now, talking to governments, to militaries around the world, really following developments, how militaries are using AI on the battlefield. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit, what are you seeing today, how militaries are adopting AI, and perhaps also how civilian AI tools are being repurposed for military applications.
Right. Well, thank you first for having me tonight. We can say that tonight because it's really, really dark. So you can basically try to classify AI applications in the military in three buckets, if you want. The first one is what AI is meant to do, which is extracting knowledge from data. And we've seen the sort of function of analytical enabler. We've seen that a lot over the last 2 years in different conflicts, being in Ukraine or in Gaza. And what AI is doing is sifting through lots of data that are generated on a battlefield, but not only on the battlefield, also among the civilian population. Each of you are now a sensor. Okay, you're all equipped with this thing, with other type of sensors like this one. And these data are not neutral when they are pulled together. And so we have numerous examples in Ukraine, for instance, where in September 2022, when the Russians started to use Shahed 136 loitering munitions from Iran, the air defense system was overwhelmed. And basically what they did was an application that any Ukrainian could download and take pictures of the drones, and then it would feed into intelligence cycle where machine learning would identify the drones, and that basically beef up this intelligence of the Ukrainians. Then you have AI as a force multiplier, especially in the use of drones. Okay, increasingly drones now are being equipped with increasing autonomy. You may have seen loitering munitions that are drones that are basically sent over a specific area, and then they have been trained to identify a specific target, and autonomously they can then destroy them. Also on the battlefield, we start to see emerging from last year robots to robots fighting. You know, there was a case last March when you had ground robots from Russia that were destroyed by drones from Ukraine, and last December it was reported that actually Ukraine launched an operation with only robots, ground vehicles and FPV drones against Russian troops, because basically the Ukraine are faced with a dilemma, the problem of they losing a lot of people and they cannot regenerate their forces. So basically they offset that by the use of these capabilities. And then you have AI as a disruptor. And here we're talking about swarms that are increasingly entering the battlefield. This year probably we'll see some true swarms entering the battlefield in Ukraine and elsewhere. And then in the field of disinformation through generative AI. And I might talk more about the convergence between AI and other emerging tech in the next question.
Yeah, thanks very much. So yeah, we have real impact of AI on weapons systems, on disinformation, information operations, on military decision-making there in conflict. And I mean, these are all things that perhaps raise some new challenges in terms of protection of civilians and compliance with the law. I know the ICRC has been thinking in some detail about some of the risks around the deployment and use of some of these technologies by militaries. I wonder if, Gilles, you would offer your perspective on some of the key risks that ICRC sees in this domain.
Certainly, Neil, and good evening, everyone. Well, as a humanitarian organization, of course, we take a very much human-centered approach to the issue raised by AI in warfare. And since we take a human-centered approach, I just want to mention to all of you standing here that there are quite a few seats. Don't be shy if you want just to have a seat, have it, you'll feel better. So, welcome. This being said, I'd like just to mention that for the ICRC, you mentioned, Neil, that it's 160 years that we work in armed conflict, and we try to see what are the impacts of both specific weapons and specific means and methods of warfare. And I want to give you just one example, is that our doctors, surgeons, have been witnessing in the 1980s, 1990s, that a lot of the war wounded were children, civilians, who exploded on an anti-personnel landmine. And this led the ICRC to join, you know, and lead also the coalition that was pushing for then the adoption of the Ottawa Treaty to prohibit what was maybe an ancestor of an autonomous weapon, which is a landmine which explodes autonomously without any human control, just by the fact that someone steps on it. So today we are confronted with a number of risks that we see, and I'd like to mention maybe three major ones. The first one is that we see the inclusion of AI in weapon systems, and of course autonomous weapons are a case in point. And this raises a number of risks, especially when the behavior of weapons becomes quite unpredictable, even for those who actually programmed it in the first place. The second risk that we see is that, and you mentioned, I think, Jean-Marc, a lot of current applications that are ongoing, that AI is used to support or sometimes to replace decision when it comes to targeting and the decision of what to target, who to target, when. And for this, we think that an element of human judgment is absolutely critical in decisions, because it has to be, of course, in sync with the fundamental principle of international humanitarian law of discrimination, of course, between civilians who are protected and militaries, but also the principles of precaution and proportionality. And finally, we see AI and machine learning used in cyber operations, cyber warfare, in information or misinformation campaigns, and this can lead to major incitements to for IHL violations. And there we also see very serious risks that brought us, the international movement of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, to propose a resolution that has been adopted unanimously by states, signatory to the Geneva Convention last October at the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, to limit and prevent risks, digital risks, for civilians in armed conflict.
Thanks, Gilles. Yeah, and perhaps I move to Rebecca next. I mean, Gilles mentioned the impact on civilians in armed conflicts, and you're dealing with one of the most vulnerable groups, refugees at UNHCR. And I wonder if you could give a sense of, on the ground, what are some of the impacts of digital technologies, including AI, on those populations?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, ICRC, for the kind invitation to our agency to this panel. And I don't aim to even speak on behalf of the 120 million people that are forcibly displaced around the world, which is staggering figure, is 1 out of 69 people in the planet, right? So out of them, there are 40 million of them that are under a mandate that actually have been very brave, cross an international border seeking safety. And as for your question, which is what I'm seeing on the ground, is there AI is creating a huge digital divide. One is online, and another one is offline. The online one, for example, is, you might be surprised because we're hyper connected, but in some cases, there's not even access to connectivity in places where they live. Refugee camps, settlements, even in urban settings, they don't have access to a SIM card because their strict regulations might ask them for identity documentation that they don't have, right? So that puts them behind of all the AI hype, especially because they don't have access to data or the internet, which AI lives in the cloud-based systems. Secondly, usually without access to connectivity, maybe they don't have access to AI services. Those AI services could be life-saving. For example, access to educational content in places where there are no teachers, or access to mental health AI-based applications to cope with a traumatic experience that they have just done. Or in places where they don't have access to work, they could have AI-based entrepreneur areas, but there's a strict regulation that in some cases they actually ban some of these AI tools for economic or political reasons. So some of them are actually victims even from, for example, the labeling industry. There's journalistic investigation, Time magazine, Wire magazine, that puts refugees and migrants, for example, that in lieu of economic opportunities, they actually go into the micro-task laboring industry for few cents and super inhumane conditions with people like 3,000 in one single little room, where they're actually just gaining a few cents because they don't have access to work in some of these places. So that's the online. But the offline, which is also worrisome, is how AI, and I agree with Gilles on this one, is translating into physical harm. So Gilles was mentioning it for misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. Specifically, narratives, they're some of the maybe combatants or people that are belligerent taking an advantage of the algorithmic bias on social media platforms and actually twisting the narratives to make them, to be xenophobic against them. So one of them is affecting them specifically and trying to have inciting to communal offline violence, right? So they're already victims of autonomous weapons. As Gilles was saying, and it's undermining us as humanitarians, right? Because we already make them achieve or arrive into a safe place, and then whenever they arrive to the same place, then algorithmic bias is actually making unsafe in a place where all this violence is living online. So yeah, that's the two trends, is offline and online, and us as a refugee agency, of course, we're working relentlessly to protect them, both offline and online, as many of you here in the room.
Thanks very much for adding that layer. I mean, it's really useful to have really specific examples of how that's affecting people on the ground. And I guess these are also raising human rights questions and concerns, as well as the international humanitarian law of armed conflict issues that Gilles mentioned. And Isabel, I wondered if you could say a little bit about that, particularly focusing on the role of the business technology community who are developing and deploying these technologies. What the kind of role and responsibility of those actors in these situations?
Yeah, thanks. Good evening. Thanks for staying on. Obviously, this is one of the topics that sort of spans the the connection between what some of the shops we're seeing on the promenade. There's a lot of tech companies out there that are obviously also selling products and services that are then sometimes happening to be used in the military context. And I think my colleague from the other sister organization in the UN has very well described what can be some of the adverse impacts on in particular refugees in that sense. So I speak for the UN Human Rights BTEC project. We actually focus on advancing responsible business conduct in the tech sector, including in conflict situations. So also when companies were wondering how should they behave in Ukraine, for example, that are some of the situations we've focused on. And in that sense, I would also like to focus on the sort of ambivalent role that the private sector can play when it comes to using AI in the military context. So just to sort of put out that boundary condition who I'm speaking for. I mean, I'm also really speaking based on the engagement we have directly with some of the leading AI companies, many of those who have their representations up on the promenade, and the type of project management processes they try to adapt in order to mitigate some of the harms that the panel has described so far. And I think that's really the sort of critical puzzle piece, because when we talk of military, often, if we're not sort of conflict experts, we think of states conducting warfare, but often the boundaries are extremely blurry, and it can also be that tech companies end up in situations where they not necessarily want to be in, but also some of these uses of tech by the private sector is actually a very conscious decision by some of the leadership. And in that mix also, the sort of boundaries between civilian tech and non-civilian tech use are very fluid. Dual use dilemmas have become extremely common. But also we should just remind that when we use technology that has been developed for civilian use cases and it's then used in a military context, it's a sort of, even a marginal error rate can result in lethal consequences for people. And I think that's always if you think about human rights risks, it's really also the companies and their management processes, if they sort of apply the standard that we use and that we engage on with them, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, you'd apply a severity of risks analysis. And of course, if somebody might die by misuse of your product, you would want to put in place the necessary mitigatory measures. So in that sense, I just wanted to stress also the responsibility that the private sector has in terms of managing the impact of their products. I'll go a little bit deeper into some of the managerial options that companies have in order to mitigate such harms. But it's really important to understand that with we're the current powerhouses in terms of developing AI and also deciding about important configurations. Companies that do that sit at the steering wheel and make very important and conscious choices about how they are involved in conflict or not. And in that sense, I'll be speaking later about some of the recommendations we've developed together with companies.
Yeah, thanks very much. And perhaps building on that, to think about, responses to some of the risks that you all have raised. I know you've only given a snapshot of the range of issues, but I know the ICRC is talking to states, to militaries, to tech companies, including AI companies. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about what kind of responses the ICRC is recommending in terms of how certain uses of AI might be constrained in conflicts.
Mm-hmm. It's very much in our DNA to speak with all actors and stakeholders who may have potential influence on civilians in zones of armed conflicts, always with a view to ensure that civilians and civilian objects and critical infrastructure is protected. And in that framework, Isabel, you mentioned that companies might find themselves in situations they would not like to be in. And indeed, there is a question that we have discussed within a global advisory group that has emitted a report that is available, where the risk for companies to take a direct part in hostilities and to then become a legitimate military target as a participant to hostilities is there. And I think it is important that companies and staff running the systems that are used to directly participate in hostilities are made aware and not only of the risks that are involved, but also of the obligations under international humanitarian law. A second aspect of our conversation is related to the three types of risks that we have discussed, and we discussed not only with companies and also with academia, scientists, but also, of course, with states. And there, when it comes to the use of AI and machine learning in weapon systems, our president and the ICRC has been calling for urgent binding regulations on autonomous weapon systems, especially to prohibit the systems or the use of autonomous weapons whose behavior is unpredictable, whose behavior cannot be predicted from A to Z on the combat zones. And this is absolutely key because there are many issues involved. First, these autonomous weapons using AI have to rely on solid, credible data. And often what is missing in zones of armed conflicts, which are quite messy, is rigorous and credible data. Data is manipulated for a whole set of reasons. And then there are also biases that we know are infusing the machine, human-machine interactions, and these biases may have also very detrimental impacts. So this is certainly a first conversation that we are having a clear regulation that prohibits certain autonomous weapons, especially those, again, who are unpredictable in behavior, but also those that actually leave life and death decisions, targeting decisions to machines only without human control and accountability. A second aspect where we think it's also quite important to intervene is the fact that the basic principles of the laws of armed conflicts, of course, apply to the kinetic world, but they do also apply to the cyberspace. And when you have attacks in the cyberspace that end up impairing medical services in a combat zone, the result is absolutely the same as if a medical facility would be attacked through, good old bombs. So we have to be extremely careful also at having an appropriate framework in this regard. And finally, I mentioned the question of using AI to support decision making. We think, indeed, AI can support more refined decision-making, especially when it comes to the principle of proportionality and the principle of precaution, but we have to make sure that AI supports humans in taking appropriate decision with appropriate accountability and do not substitute humans who might decide to, because of over trust, too much trust would say, well, I can trust what I get in terms of support to decision making when it comes to targeting decisions.
Thanks a lot, Gilles. And perhaps the same question to you, Isabel, or a similar one. What type of responses is the UN proposing, and what do you see actually how businesses and tech companies in practice what's their role in implementing those to address some of these concerns?
Just to say, that also the UN has a mixed track record in terms of the use of technology, and we are aware of that. And the UN Human Rights Office in particular has been pushing through an initiative for the UN's own use of technology. So there's a new policy in terms of, which is based on human rights. It's a human rights due diligence approach. So just to say that, and that has an impact on a lot of partnerships also that the UN holds with the private sector. I want to make just a step back in the responsible business conduct community. We used to always have a metaphor which doesn't work so well anymore. In an analog sort of approach, we always use the metaphor of a kitchen knife, and I think it helps a little bit to understand where we are now in terms of the potential complicity of the private sector. So in the sense that, think of the responsibility that a company has that sells a kitchen knife, right? It crosses the counter, the customer walks home with the kitchen knife, and then the question arises whether it's the responsibility of the company that produces the kitchen knife to safeguard against whatever will be done with that kitchen knife, right? You can use it to prepare steak, but also you can evidently inflict harm on a human. And back then, of course, you can say, well, really that responsibility of the company sort of stops there at the counter where the customer, buys the knife and whatever. Now we know that with AI, this is increasingly more complex. We know that in many contexts, private sector actors can still influence operations with their AI products and services, even if that sort of purchasing point has passed. And in that sense, there is also a leverage that companies hold in terms of determining how their products and services are used after deployment. It depends, of course. I mean, the products are so different in terms of their configurations, and it depends, of course, if what type of contractual arrangement they are. But in some circumstances, we know that the companies that we work with have taken measures in order to be able to control some dual-use scenarios and make decisions when actually it's not okay. And of course, there's also some other legal measures to guardrail that. So just re-emphasizing the role of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in that regard, and also the role of the OECD guidelines for responsible business conduct, which are sort of the two leading global standards on responsible business conduct. And the OECD is also going to publish a guide on due diligence in AI in the coming months. So just watch out for that. And I think there's some important guidance also coming in terms of the concept that we promote, which is called heightened human rights due diligence. So basically, if you think of due diligence for, let's say, political risk, environmental risk, or whatsoever, you apply the same concept in terms of identifying, preventing, and mitigating risk to people to a conflict scenario. Sounds super easy in theory and on a panel in Davos. In practice, that's extremely complex. But it's the idea that companies can put in place conflict-sensitive policies, that they have strict escalation procedures. So if scenario A happens, this is the path that will be triggered inside the company. Of course, today we probably heard a lot about red teaming exercises. You can also do red teaming exercises for conflict scenarios with regard to the potential harm on people, pilots and sandboxes for determining risks and sort of testing different solutions. But then also in conflict situations, sometimes you cannot share all information. There might be volatility in terms of disinformation and cyber threats connected to that. So there's the importance of documenting what is happening, even if it's just inside the company, documenting what you can see in terms of how your products are being used. And then if you're not able to share it in the moment, you can at least share it later on when there might be fact-finding commissions or whatsoever. And then evidently, from this approach of a due diligence idea, also a learning from similar scenarios to inform better practice in the future. And yeah, just to say, I'm of course not disclosing what some of the companies are doing today, because we also want to keep the trusted environment we have with them. But this is some of the practices that we see are now emerging. And of course, the private sector is not a monolith, and there are some laggards and some leaders in this field, but there's also a lot of room for action, and I think a lot of companies are stepping up for really taking their responsibility to respect human rights in conflict zones seriously.
Yeah. Thank you. And it's interesting because you mentioned the responsibility of tech actors, and we talked about responsibility of militaries, but obviously humanitarian actors that are deploying AI technologies, with the aim of helping people, supporting populations. Maybe in a time of crisis, there's a pressure to sort of adopt some AI tools that offer certain benefits. And how do you balance, Rebecca, these type of risks and opportunities presented by AI for humanitarian applications?
Yeah, there's a lot of internal and external pressure to create AI tools that actually can speed up, optimize, augment human capacity, right? And in places where you have population asking you for help, you might go with the intention of just go and rapidly deploying those tools, no? And I think our agency has the four approach. One, Isabel, as we said, with sister agencies, of course, mentioned the human rights due diligence policy, right? Which is now our kind of like star guide, which is telling us on what to do or what not to do. Even if with good intentions trying to do AI, it could actually potentially lead to more harm to populations. Example, we can violate the right for non-discrimination. Right for non-discrimination, for example, an AI tool actually doing eligibility of humanitarian assistance or eligibility for asylum procedures like relocation, resettlement, targeting. One of the other things is the right to privacy. Some of these tools, if they're reverse engineered easily, then they can actually unveil the data that they have been entrusted by us, and this is the second part, which is the data protection, and actually put them in more harm in potentially depriving their lives and other, the fear of persecution that they have. Now, with data protection, and we have, I would say, one of the strongest and more strict data protection policies in the UAE agency, because we can cause a lot of harm if the data that people have entrusted us, and this is what we share with ICSC, data protection, goes into the hands of, I would say, actors that are hostile towards refugees. And data protection for us, and it's kind of like the cornerstone for the work that we do, the data of refugees have been entrusted to us. They're the owners of their own data, and we are the processors, similar to what you have in LPD in Switzerland or in GDPR in the EU. And we're one of the first agencies that in Article 41 of our general data protection policy has embedded autonomous decision-making systems, which is the name for also in the EU for the AI, which is to not create tools that actually could potentially harm the data of the people, direct data they have entrusted. Finally, with the ethics approach, and the ethics approach means with our innovation mindset. I'm representing the innovation team here. In ethics, we have something that is, besides our humanitarian principles ethics, that we go beyond the 100 ethical principles that companies and other actors design. We have humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence. And the main one is the do no harm one. So for example, even doing a chatbot, that you can say, oh my God, we have thousands of calls of people asking if they could save return of not home back to Syria now. And you can say, okay, if we do a chatbot, maybe we can lift up the whole work that the humanitarian workers work in the call center. They receive thousands of calls and say, oh, it could be easy to do that very quickly, easy peasy. No, actually, a chatbot can give incomplete, inaccurate, or actually very harmful information in the sense, wrong information to a refugee that is seeking safety, and then therefore harming them in another way, if not done in a proper way that is alignment with the data protection, with humanitarian principles, and also with the ethical approach that we take as humanitarians. And finally, the innovation mindset that we have is that we don't design tools without them. So, for example, and this is not SAI related, but if we have the Refugee-Led Innovation Fund, which is giving seed funding to grassroots led organizations. One of them, Welcome France, amazing organization, grassroots NGO, is doing an AI app for helping the newcomers to get access to financial services, AI and financial services, you might know the high HIP, but actually it's helping for those who are, again, without documentation, and Welcome, it's a neobank, Welcome France, Welcome account is a neobank, but if they manage to do it with AI, then they can leave the examples to other financial institutions in France for giving them access to bank accounts. And this is thanks to AI and, of course, data privacy that is taken into account. And that is because refugees are leading the way on doing their own applications themselves, on how they can actually, we can support them. We just give them the funding to do so and the space to do so in a safe way.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and perhaps shifting a bit now back to the military applications. I mean, obviously, humanitarian applications, the idea is to do no harm, and militaries, integrating AI into weapon systems and so on in some situations. I mean, the idea is to cause harm, and it's constrained in some ways by the law and so on. Perhaps, Jean-Marc, you could say a little bit about how some of the risks or the implications of AI on the battlefield are being sort of seen by militaries and governments, and the sort of international efforts that are underway to tackle them.
Yeah, so at the UN level, you have this governmental group of experts on lethal autonomous weapon systems, so LOWs or killer robots for the general public. That has been started in 2014, and the idea is to discuss whether the international community should come up with a ban on these weapons or not. And so this group is meeting twice a year in Geneva, and they came up with 11 principle in 2019, but what you have to understand is this technology is profoundly transformative for governments. And if you look back the last 30 years, we were living in a world that we call the end of the Cold War. And I think since February 2022, we have entered the era of the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was characterized by happy globalization, multilateralism, cooperation. This end of the Cold War world is characterized by national interest, by increased polarization. And if we haven't managed to come up with a ban over the last 10 years, it's very unlikely that we will come up with a ban in the next 10 years, given the increasing polarized environment we're in. Now, if you look back where we were in 2014 in terms of technology, AI, on the battlefield, it was very marginal, almost non-existent. Look at where we are today, okay, and try to think where we will be in 10 years' time. So there are initiatives like the GGE on laws. There are also a conference called REAIM, which basically try to come up with responsible use of AI in the military. You have a few countries that are totally in favor of pushing this agenda, but on the other hand, you have also countries that see a very important strategic advantage in pushing a different agenda. Then you have the ethical issue. If you ask a Ukrainian battlefield these days, okay, would you like to use autonomous weapons in order to spare the lives of your soldiers? Last October or November, we witnessed the highest mortality rate on the battlefield on the Russian side. More than 2,000 Russian soldiers lost their life on a daily basis. The Ukrainians cannot afford such a huge rate of casualties. So for them, to offset that with technology is actually seen as positive. So you can see that depending where you look at, you have to come up with different arguments. And then the last thing is that this technology is profoundly civilian and democratizes very, very quickly. So what we're talking about here is not nuclear weapons where you need to have, infrastructures and nuclear materials and fissile material, which is difficult to get. Here we're talking about lines of codes. Once a genius is out, it's out. And there is actually no way for governments to actually curb how this technology will use or repurpose for malicious uses. So the issue in terms of international governance is immense because it's no longer just identifying a few actors that play a major role. It's actually now down almost to a single individual, and increasingly we have to factor in the autonomy of machine, and robots will become actors of themselves in international security. So you can see the complexity of the governance system we are faced with, because it's not just governments, it's also the private sector, it's also scientists that have to actually come up and talk to each other.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and perhaps we have about 15 minutes left, and I really want to bring in some questions. So we'll talk a little bit now about some of the opportunities presented by AI in conflict zones. And if I just ask you all to be quite brief in your intervention, just so that we have that chance. So, Isabel, to you, just that question really. What do you see as some of the opportunities presented by the use of AI in conflict zones, perhaps to enhance human rights protections?
Yeah. We just heard all the different. It's really important to remember that now conflict is just not. It's not a state-to-state thing. We have the companies have a very active role. They can be also complicit. It's important that academia is in the game, and we've seen really helpful use cases where AI was employed to detect and respond to cyber threats in conflict, to disinformation campaigns. AI technologies in the military domain can also be used to enhance protection of civilians. So, example, by leveraging AI to mitigate civilian harm. And I think also what has come out is really that the verification and the representativeness of the data is very important to ensure the accuracy, because without the accuracy, we might have a lot of errors that we really do not want to have in conflict situations. So that's why also working on this multi-stakeholder approach, bringing in voices also from the affected communities, to avoid unintended consequences is really important. And then I think there's a lot of potential when that contextual balance is clear.
Thanks. Yeah, and Jill, I know ICRC has a number of practical initiatives partnering with ETHZ, the EPFL, and others, practical applications of AI. Maybe you could give us one or two examples there.
Yeah, I have a few examples, but it would take some time. Let me just revert back to what Jean-Marc you mentioned about the fast pace of development and democratization of the technology, and the comparison you made with nuclear weapons. And I think this really calls for urgent regulation in the interest of everyone. And I think this has to be understood in spite of the environment of greater polarization that you described. And when you speak of nuclear weapons, typically one example of saying, should we now, with all the hype on AI, jump to AI by default? No, I think that there are reasonable reasons to say that some domains should not be governed by AI in any way, and I think the question of control and command of nuclear weapons is a case in point. Now to your question, of course, it's a Janus-faced phenomenon, and we are engaged with universities, with scientific centers and labs on trying to use AI to be better at assisting and protecting people affected by armed conflicts. And for instance, with ETH in Zurich, we have developed this system that allows us to really improve the supply chain of drugs for health services in conflict zones, especially drugs that need the cold chain, so that we are sure that we have the drugs we need, but we don't have too much that we have to waste then because of, and we learn a lot through these systems to be better at supply chain. Another example which we developed with EPFL and Yale is actually about large multimodal languages. And we have two cases. One is a chatbot for doctors who are in a resource-scarce environment and have to provide medical assistance to people who don't have access to sophisticated medical services. But the other one is an internal chatbot that we are using for international humanitarian law. And it's very interesting because we have been, with the universities, EPFL and Yale, developing and promoting an algorithm and then feeding with the data. The idea is to have a sealed space where we can also add confidential data in order to have an extremely fast analysis of any given situation that provides all the references based on jurisprudence, based on expert views, based on, of course, all the legal texts, that allows then our legal experts to work on that basis and, of course, to redress any hallucination as need be, in order to be much faster in engaging states and parties to armed conflict on their responsibilities and obligations under specific situations. And maybe a last point, you mentioned it, Niels, it's an initiative with Waseda University, where we are developing drones with sensors that can detect unexploded ordnances, including the type of substance that might be in these unexploded ordnances, and that's hopefully will be extremely useful for the sake of removing unexploded remnants of war, especially in cities, in urban areas.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, some fascinating and practical examples, so it's really useful to hear those. Rebecca, I don't know if you would like to add a few from a UNHCR perspective.
Of course, for us it's more on the anticipatory humanitarian action field. We started back in 2017 with Project Jetson, which was trying to actually anticipate the number of arrivals of IDPs and refugees arriving into the border of Davos, Ethiopia, and IDPs within Somalia. And then we moved with Brazil team doing predictive analytics, which was allowing them to anticipate the number of arrivals into the refugee area, Pacaraima, which has urban settlements, and actually allocate them into the settlements. So if we knew the number of arrivals before, then we knew where to put them if they needed a special protection, because usually 10 or 20% of them are very, very vulnerable. And then also be able to prepare in case there was a huge influx to us, for us to update our contingency plans. Now, a recent initiative sponsored by the government of Luxembourg, which is UNHCR Global Early Warning System, trying to learn from these practices from these country offices that have worked in special pilots and do it on a global level. So trying to anticipate not only the arrivals, but also maybe some of the push and pull factors that are making people move. So that's only in population flow, but you can anticipate anything, as you were saying, supply chain or assistance needs or things that they might, whenever they're arriving, they might need. The second one is understanding refugee needs. So in generative AI specifically, the team of El Salvador and many other of the cases that we're doing with innovation in our IT team, El Salvador uses Gen AI, or actually had a project on it, to read the text for participatory assessments. If you're not a humanitarian, participatory assessments are the surveys that have text-based data, the focus group discussion transcriptions, and the interview transcriptions that we do with the populations to understand the needs, what do they need, what they care, what they commissar for. That is usually done manually, especially if it's not needed to be translated. So we're using the good way of a generative AI actually helping us transcribe, and save us a lot of hours of manual work that is actually being done, especially in non-native languages or indigenous languages where AI still is not there, like Kurdistani Iraq team working on a transcription tool from Kurdish actually into English. And finally, which is a bit on the understanding also their needs, not only understanding their needs from the perspective of, like us doing the improving humanitarian services, but when we improve humanitarian services, we need to do it with them, right? So a lot of our funds that we have in the innovation service, again, the seed capital funding that we do either to colleagues or to refugee-led organizations, they are actually telling us what they need the most. And so I cannot tell you, especially the trends of, because usually they come to us saying we need in financial services, we need in against content moderation against us in this country. So that's also another one. Like in order to improve, refugee or forcibly displaced services, is usually also given mechanisms for them to express themselves and what they need.
Thanks. And
Fans.
to have some applause. Jean-Marc, just very quickly, zooming back out on the geopolitical challenges and current conflicts today, you were, I guess, quite pessimistic. Do you see any sort of realm where AI might help strengthen international security, or do we really need to be very much focused on the risk? And just, if you're very brief on that, and then we'll open the floor to...
Well, technology is never one side. What we're witnessing is that the advances in terms of offensive uses of technology, and then you also have ways to use it for defensive purposes. So if you want to have a glimpse of what we should monitor in the near future, because that will also lead to development in the humanitarian space, agentic AI. Okay, increasingly we'll have autonomous agents that will help fight wars and take decisions and go beyond that. So get ready for growing level of autonomy on the battlefield. Then with that, you also have, if you combine autonomous agent, the idea is also to get emerging properties. Like I was talking about swarms earlier, what we're witnessing now is saturation of the enemy's defense system through mass. But what is the holy grail of swarming is really emerging properties. So the idea of combining units together and creating something, a whole that is superior to the addition of single units, all right? And so some people are working on that. Then you have to go beyond that also to look at other emerging technologies. It's not just AI, it's synthetic biology, it's neurotech, metaverses, and the combinatorial impact of this technology is very, very complex. If you take Gen AI and SynBio, you start to have really frightening scenarios that you also have to monitors. Gilles, you are talking about nuclear weapons. No one is foolish enough to argue for autonomous nuclear weapons, but increasingly AI is making its headway into command and control system. So NC3 is becoming now an issue, and our center, we have already organized last year 2 dialogues on that, because basically when AI is actually filtering the information and coming up with some proposal for the decision makers, then you also have a impact of AI. And the last 2 thing is increasingly our brain, it will be paired with the machine, and therefore we'll be able to extract some knowledge out of this, and increasingly we'll have augmenting human beings that could be for good and for bad. And the last thing, which is not much talked about, is that it's these big companies that are in the driving seats. And what we're witnessing is that they are in a huge competition between each other. And there is a tendency, maybe to have more relaxed rules in terms of development. And that could create also security issues, because if you relax the rules in terms of security or ethical principles, then we can end up in an ungoverned race for developing, for instance, higher forms of AI.
Thanks. Yeah, too many risks, too many opportunities, which is why I've chaired this very badly and left very little time for questions. But let's just take a couple of questions. We'll take them together. If you introduce yourself, keep it brief, and then we'll go back to the panel. We have one gentleman there.
Do we have a mic now?
Yes, it's coming.
Sorry. Thank you. Hello, my name is Yaroslav Azhnuk. I'm Ukrainian. I'm a tech company founder, the CEO of the company called The Fourth Law. We're actually making the killer drones, the autonomous killer drones you were talking about today. It was very, very interesting. You know, sometimes felt like, watching the Don't Look Up, but just for the second time. Have plenty to say on this topic. I actually have one of these autonomous drones with me, if you want to look at it later. But I guess my big question for all of us is, we all understand these technologies, AI in conflict can be used by all the sides. And the good news, the Ukrainians, us making all of these drones, we are on the good side. We are the eastern frontier of the Western civilization. But then the bad guys will have the very same technologies. So how do we reconcile, from one side, our civilized approach to making sure these technologies are appropriately regulated and are not used in a bad way, with the fact that we know that our adversaries are not gonna hold back. We just saw Russians cutting heads of two Ukrainian soldiers. They just don't care. Red Cross was not allowed to Ukrainian people in detention, Russian detention for all time of the conflict. So how do we reconcile that when, an adversarial country shows up with, Ukraine was able to make 2 million of these FPV drones last year. China can make 2 billion easily. They show up with 2 billion autonomous drones, fully autonomous, and that is probably possible this year. What do we do? Do we regulate or do we stimulate? Because in my view, for a better world, we need actually to stimulate defensive AI so that we can protect ourselves and we don't have war. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'd really like to get the panel's views on this. What do you think is a sort of response? I mean, it's a kind of challenge for international law and arms control in general, often, this type of question. I mean, would anyone like to take this, Gilles?
Of course, yeah.
No, I think it's a critical question, and maybe it's my main conclusion. But maybe you want to take a few other questions, or because of time constraints, I wonder. If not, I just take that one.
Let's do that. Can we run over a couple of minutes, or how are we doing? We have one question here and then one at the back.
I had the same question, but from a Swiss neutral perspective, but it's going into the same direction.
Okay.
Oh, God.
We'll merge those.
One down.
At the back, please.
André de Zucco-Pietri, I'm running JEDI, which is the European version of DARPA. The French have apparently 5 days in a modern conflict type Ukraine of ammunition. The Germans 4 days. So we are obviously not at all prepared. Is there an opportunity for AI to be a game changer, to lead again, and to change this very big imbalance between our conventional warfare that we have today, where obviously we didn't invest enough in the last 20 years? I mean, how much can it allow us to reshuffle the cards, and are we doing it? Are we really investing in these technologies enough? I would love to hear, especially from Jean-Marc and Gilles, his views. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We had one more, I think, down here, and then we'll have to go back to the panel.
I'll just
Please.
say like that. So, very similar to that, the Ukrainian conflict played a quite significant role in advancing the technologies in the last 2 years. So the role of the conflicts that are erupting and are bound to erupt in the future, whether that exacerbates the speed of growth and how the governments, we spoke about the companies, but we didn't really speak about the governments, and he's sort of referring to that very specifically, are reacting in your research and in your experience, but also whether your recommendations to the governments would be, in fact, as the other gentleman said, to stimulate or to restrict. That's a dilemma, but recommendations of the experts, I think that's what.
Okay, thanks. Well, yeah, so I suppose we have the two major questions. There's one on, what do we do about, at the international level, how to bring everyone along into an agreed standard about what is or is not acceptable or lawful. I guess that's a question for Gilles. And then more for Jean-Marc on the point about how AI is going to impact and change the landscape of military capabilities and influence over the coming years. Gilles.
Yeah, last year we marked the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. And we held reflection talks, conversations across the world to reflect on the fact that 75 years ago, the militaries, states, governments agreed unanimously to a set of rules based on what they had learned the hard way during the Second World War in particular. And these Geneva Conventions were really meant to be valid and applied precisely in the midst of armed conflicts, in the worst circumstances, to avert a repetition of the horrors that they had witnessed before. And the militaries were pragmatic enough to try to strike an appropriate balance between what we call military necessity on the one hand and humanity on the other. And this delicate balance is reflected in fundamental principles that are as valid in the kinetic world as they are now with what we just discussed during this panel. And I think that there is no way out now to certainly stop and reverse a trend towards overly lax, permissive interpretations of what the founding writers of the Geneva Conventions had very much in mind, and to redress this to make compliance with international humanitarian law a political priority. And this has to be a political priority across boundaries, because if it's us against them, it won't lead us anywhere. So with the International Committee of the Red Cross, we have liaised with the first 6 states, but inviting all the others in a global initiative to try to bring IHL again as a political priority. And it's absolutely key that this infuses other conversations. And I will give you just one case in point. I was recently at a conversation on the impact of climate change, which hits first and foremost conflict-affected communities across the Sahel and elsewhere. And we say, how can we make communities more resilient? Actually, the first thing is to have a basic principle of IHL upheld so that water systems, wastewater treatment systems, hospitals, and the rest are not destroyed. And I think that there is a need now to get the international community understanding that it's in the interest of everyone, not only for the sake of humanity and to avert the worst humanitarian conferences, but also in terms of security in the mid to long run. There is no other option that I see, and I think that it is key that we build this consensus based on the fact that 196 states have signed on the Geneva Conventions, and that these were drafted on hard-won experiences, and they were drafted by people who were deemed realistic. And these, I think, on the one hand, what we hear politically across the world is no one denying that they are relevant, that they apply, but then way too much conversation on the fact that it's the other. And because the other, then we can just do whatever. And I think this is a downward spiral we have to stop, reverse, and address by making this a political priority and a foreign policy priority.
Thanks, Gilles. And finally, Jean-Marc, how would you say the kind of impact on military capability, security dynamics plays into all of that?
Yeah, so what you have to be careful of is say, well, infantry and tanks are no longer part of the military arsenal. Now, what we're witnessing is a combination of these, and therefore the current military arsenal is much more complex than it used to be. So it's about innovation, how the military can actually integrate this new technology. And I think Ukraine is a test lab, and all Western countries now go to Ukraine in terms of lessons learned, because they basically have the experience of developing these drones. But we are focusing very much on states. Again, what we are not looking at is the non-state actors. And we had 2 examples in the last 30 years where that should, ring alarm bells. Is Arum Shurikiyo, a sect in Japan that did the attack in Seoul in a subway in Tokyo, and ISIS. If this technology falls in the hands of millenarist movements, that for them, no negotiation is possible. We are up for major catastrophe. So that's also an interest of states to be really careful of not diffusing some of these technologies. So Neil is doing diplomatic dialogues, I'm also doing diplomatic dialogues, and we are talking with governments on key governments in the field of this combination of this emerging tech. And I think that's very important that we come to an understanding, at least, that there are some this technology that should not diffuse. The issue is how do you contain that? It's very, very difficult. And I will stop here because I have to leave.
No, yeah, that's fine.
I think we have gone over time, so I mean, we could continue the conversation. I really hope everyone will with the speakers afterwards. But I mean, I think it's reassuring that despite the challenges, there is this mutual interest in some risk reduction. There is some people say often when a new technology emerges, well, what do we do? Because existing rules don't apply. But actually, they do. They're very much designed to apply to technology as it evolves. So that's some reassurance. And thank you very much to our panelists, Isabelle, Gilles, Jean-Marc, Rebecca. Thank you all for being here and all your questions.